Hey everybody, welcome back to the 25th episode of Open Source for Business, brought to you by Open Teams. My name is Henry Badgery, and today I talked with Johannes Tigges, the Assistant Secretary at the InnerSource Commons Foundation. Johannes provided a lot of insight into what InnerSource is and how it can benefit organizations, and we dived even deeper into something he is definitely an expert in, and that is remote work and how we can learn a lot from open source communities. Now, whether you are a user, developer, manager, or you're just curious about the industry, then Open Teams is the place to find the information, news, training, and support that you need to thrive with open source software. Now that the introductions are out of the way, let's dive into this episode. All right, Johannes, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
My pleasure, Henry.
I've been very excited to chat with you, and I know you've been working at the InnerSource Commons Foundation. You're currently the Assistant Secretary. So
Exactly.
Can we talk a bit about how you actually got into that position, how you got into open source, and get a bit of an idea of your story up until today?
Oh yeah, sure. So that all happened more or less, well, by semi-accident, if you will. So back a long time, one assistant lecturer told us about open source and what it can be, and I have actually at that point never heard of it because I grew up when there was still like the Windows is of this world, and Linux was, yeah, technically it was this thing, but it was not install a Ubuntu or Red Hat or what have you on your system. And so Windows was fine, but what he told me actually sounds fine. Like you can work together with other people and you don't need to do everything twice and all these things. And there are licenses that can sort of protect it, and you'll come out with common goods and all that. And that was really interesting to me. And then I ended up going through research organizations that like software research and all that, where you basically can do parts of that, and there's sorts of collaboration. That was nice at that point. And then fast forward some 10 years or whatever that might have been, I ended up at a company named Here Technologies, which does make maps, for example, like the digital maps, one of the 4 or 5 map makers of this world. And they're within something called an open source programs office, which the listeners to this podcast very likely know by now. And we figured like, is it possible to apply open source methods within a company? If you're a really large company, and you might actually end up having something that looks akin to a bit of a silo, or you may not, but it isn't unheard of. Let me put it like that. And open source methods like strengthening collaboration and all that might help there. And so I feel like, okay, Googled around a bit. There must have been people who did open source inside of companies. I'm not the first one here. And as it is most of the times the case with open source, yes, they are. And in that case, it was called InnerSource. And it turns out that it is also a thing with the earliest research papers going from, I guess, 2005. And don't ask me who started it. I mean, the term was coined by Tim O'Reilly, if I remember correctly. But there were like Philips things going on, and Bosch, for example, with their so-called BIOS program, Bosch Internal Open Source. And then figured, yeah, oh right, there is actually quite the research body, and there's this nice community called the InnerSource Commons. And by that time, I mean, if you have a company that is really big, like thousands of people's big, and you want to try to change a company and bring something there, you can't just separate, like divide yourself into multiple pieces or just multiply. That is not how it works. But what you can do is create teaching material, and that is almost as good as multiplying yourself, as you at least get some multiplication effect and multiplicator effects. And knowing that creation of teaching material, like those online courses, is actually quite the effort. More than if you would do it in presence, where you can correct everything. And this is not the effort I can do as a one-man show with a bit of support here. So I thought, well, is there maybe something? And it turned out, yes, there is something. There is something called the InnerSource Commons Learning Path, because this problem is actually a problem that a lot of other people had. For example, at Nike, with Russ Rutledge, and within BIOS with Georg Ritter, or Denise Cooper had it at that time with PayPal. And it turns out that also Isabel Drostrom, who is at Europace, um, they all had similar problems. And and the nice part is that I happen to know Isabel, and Europace is also in Berlin, where I'm located. So I try to contribute it a bit to the learning path and say, all right, there's already great material. Like I can totally use that already. And because InnerSource basically is, if you will, it reproduces parts of how the Apache model looks like, and basically makes a bit of an easier approach to common open source terms such as the maintainer role, which InnerSource calls the trusted committer, but more or less that's the maintainer, and the fusion of the managing and product owning role, if you will, plus the technical role, which is your average open source maintainer. And then you have a bit of what do I do as a contributor, and why would I actually want to do this? So something you can show to someone who you want to possibly motivate to actually let you do that. And there are a few funny side effects if you do it in a company, because then you are in a hierarchical structure, and people who can tell you what to do, which is less so the case in open source, or in the case of corporate open source and in a company collaboration, it is still individual actors, not centrally controlled actors. So minor differences, but in the end that is open source. And I always say InnerSource is the bridge towards open source, as in you learn the skills there, then you know how to swim in a nice pool, and then you can go out to the pool that has sharks and those special Australian jellyfish. Hopefully not. Um, and I heard they call like
The box
a
jellyfish?
Würfelqualle. Yeah, the box jelly. Yeah, perfect.
Yes.
Those I heard they are really like
Very
dangerous.
dangerous, lethal.
Oh, ah. So you don't want them there, or if you want, like, you know how to deal with them. So those are not in the inner source pool, but like the box jellyfish of open source is all the licenses and having to work completely in the open. That is something that many people don't like from the get-go if they haven't been in contact with open source in the first place. So that's actually nice. But you should absolutely not stop at inner source, like just within the company. I mean, some things are not really meant to be open source because they are, for example, a business differentiator. You don't want to publish them. But don't like that is something I heard, like people, yeah, we know we're doing inner source. Well, that is all you have to do for open source. Please try it as an opportunity, like to level up your people and skill them up. And if you have something where you have a good business case to actually publish, then please do, because open source still has all the advantages and is the real thing, if you will. And you can reduce your silo effects. So there is only opportunities to win in there, but there's also more opportunities to win in open source. So don't just let them go. So advertisement section end. But that is that. And because I heard cases where people stopped inside, although they would have had a motivation to go open. So that's why I mention it. And yeah, so there was this learning path, and that was like really useful. And then we figured that we need the contributor section, so the role that actually adds to a project. And here we had basically, we have no one to do that. And it was like writing all the articles. The learning path is videos plus articles. And it was like writing articles. And all right, who do we have who could do the next section? And by that point, I was getting close to the maintainer, a trusted committer role, as in being really active in the project and working with Russ and the rest. I was like, why don't you like would you be interested in doing a video? And then having knowing Isabel, why don't we bring Isabel on board? And so that happened, that I basically made the video with her and wrote the articles and all that. And we actually also had a nice studio that we filmed that in, with a very nice support by O'Reilly, where you can also have the learning part on their platform. And doing all that, it basically ends that I ended up also basically participating in their governance system. And as you like a company, if it grows large enough, it will have some sort of governance, whatever it might look like. Just a bunch of people meeting every now and then and say, like, what do we do? Or in a smaller open source project, the person like, what do I do? Do I want to take that on? Governance. And at some point, we decided to turn InnerSource Commons, like a group of people, just into one of these US 501c3 like nonprofit entities, so we can have the usual benefits of that and since I was already quite active in that position, I like worked with getting that going, getting it running. I ended up in, I guess, a start of last year, not only as the one of the first members, as in 501c3 gets you a member status as like a co-owner. You could. It's not a union, not a union as in credit union, but it's sort of goes there. I mean, those who might be familiar with the IRS code more than me, since I'm not American, probably know what that is, but it's basically a member-owned entity, non-profit. So that is what it is. And since we do rotate directors, there was like someone wanted to rotate out of being director, and it's like, I already did things that looked very secretary, and apparently I look like a person that can do that. So I got elected, and that's how I ended up there. And so that's that. And we try to do as much as we can in a remote basis and on a written basis. So there is a Slack according to it, or next to it we got use some email. And something that has worked for us, if we do a synchronous working meeting, then we actually take minutes, or like we call them notes, but they're sort of minutes, like extended, specially structured minutes. Nothing fancy actually, but it does work. So everyone who hasn't been there can just read them, and they do, because now the comments have actually grown significantly. I don't have the current numbers in mind, but they're a good 4-digit number. And we have people from regularly active people actually from Japan, for example, from China. I think there are quite a few people from India right now. Obviously, lots of European people from, for example, France, Spain, Germany, Ireland, UK, Russia, and so that's just the top of my mind. And then there are obviously lots of people from the US, and so more or less across all time zones. So we have to sort of work with that.
Mhm.
And open
So
source basically being same as in contributors from everywhere has to deal with that too. So that is sort of more or less native to me.
right, you've taken a lot of the principles and techniques that open source communities adopt and use through open collaboration, working in different time zones, and that kind of thing. And you've applied it within your business and it's worked. You mentioned something along the lines of a written. It's very important to write everything down because that's how
Oh
the open
yes,
source communities work. So could you dive a little bit into that? Like, why is it so important to have everything written down, and what does that look like for a company?
yes, of course I can do that. Um, so we all know documentation, and we know documentation is outdated the moment we have written it. That's why nobody likes to write documentation. And then I'm like, well, what should I write in it? And la, 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 la. I mean, some people like document, like writing the proper documentation. I mean, it has been heard of IT. Some IT security people like to write big swaths of paper, and some say, oh, we need action, not paper. Like, I'm not getting into that discussion which one is better, but those two exist in any case. Um, but what you can do is, and that is actually what we're doing each and every day now more than ever, with all those text messengers, for example, like Slack, or what do we have, WhatsApp or Signal, or what they are called. Like in the earlier days, we had the texts, limited size text, and there is the Twitter, obviously. Um, and then we have issues, for example, we have all the emails we write. And then there are one of the backbones of open source, mailing lists. Like, oh, I all know mailing lists, but so open source being tech and tech being special, that basically means people put a bit of software below it, such that you don't just cram 50,000 addresses in your recipient bar, but you actually cram one address in there, and then it just hub and spoke distributes it to whomever is subscribed there, which basically makes it easier for people to add and remove them. And if you do that, you can actually have proper threading, and you can have a proper archive, and like all these sorts of things. And the software from the 90s, I guess, yeah, Mailman is probably from the 90s. It looks like that, but it still works. Can also get you a digest, like what happened this day. And if you, for example, have the Linux kernel mailing list, which is famous for Linus's outbursts at topics that really he does not like, and at times he is completely on point there with, because some things are like not really what should happen. But like that happens. But there is also lots of civilized discourse, and you cannot, like, there are, I would guess, 100 or maybe 1,000 messages per day. You do not want to read them individually. I mean, you want to access them individually, maybe some of them, and then you basically get a threaded structure, and you can follow it in the archive. That is what such documentation may look like. If you have an issue, there are your average corporate issues, I will call them now, which is basically a header line, and it's on the board, and that is about it. And if you want to know what the hell was actually supposed to be going on there, you're supposed to ask the person, um, who may or may not remember what this was supposed to be. And then there are issues that are a bit more complete. We can like read it, or have this, since they have this lovely comment function, read what has evolved and what might need to be done. Like if you have a definition of done, if that happens to be active in your company, like can check things off. So that is what such documentation may look like. And if you then remember that you can basically, for example, in the case of chats, group chats, for example, your average Slack channel, or yet another visitor out of the olden days, IRC, which is Slack just public standardized and less colorful. You can archive that and make it indexable, like put links on it, everything you can do with Slack as well. And this is basically something that I'll take the term from Isabel, but it's more or less of a standing term, passive documentation, because you don't actually actively write it, but it just is there. And the moment you can link to it, you can search it, and it is permanent, you can actually use it for reference purposes. And if the case is, oh, but isn't that a huge chaos, and like, wow, you need to properly write this down in a formal way and all that? Yes, you do. Some things you should actually write up in a structured, formal way that is entirely correct, but not everything. And we all know these decisions that happen basically in the next to the water station, or over a coffee and all that, or basically just in the aftermath of a meeting, like the meeting after meeting. God, do I hate those. And especially if you do them in an open plan office next to someone who tries to work. My pet peeve, sorry. um, and like the ones I don't really like, please don't do that. Then there are decisions that are just coming up, like ad hoc somewhere, and they are still in effect. And at least in my observation, prototypes are the most resilient things this planet has. And so those things basically end up in these messages, end up in these emails, end up in these whatever. So if you then have a chance to actually say, well, it is like it is, let's accept it, let's conserve them and link to them. Yeah, and that is basically what goes in there on there. And yes, you can totally link to an email that has this singular decision going on in one of your more formal documentation parts. That works. And if you then happen to amass like 50,000 of them, fine. Like condense them onto a web page in a good way, hopefully, and you have a more formal documentation. But that basically takes away a lot of these. We need to write it up. What should we write in there? What did we talk about? Like all these sorts of problems. Like here you go. Just I'll link you there, just as you would forward whatever sort of email you might have had. This is actually not bad. I mean, you can, as long as you make all of this as explicit as possible. Here's how we're going to do this. Yes, this is okay. We'll make these indexable and accessible for everyone, and all that. Then you actually don't exclude people, so everyone can see that happened. We're agreeing on that one, so and then this and that. And this happens in issues. This happens in, code is something different, but sort of comparable because it has the same features and versions. It happens across chat conversations, and yes, there are wikis, which are the formal documentation of this. And for example, the Apache Software Foundation, who has brought you some fun things such as the Apache HTTPD, the web server, which still powers lots and lots of the web in the internet's websites, or Hadoop, one of those big data software pieces, like lots of them. Tomcat, probably still used. All Apache software, and they are actually using that approach, and it has worked. Only mailing lists, plus now they have a Slack actually, and it works for them since 20 years, and the software wouldn't be there if that would completely not work. And what this gets you actually is the case of you're being resilient against time zones, and you're being resilient against people leaving, which they will at some point in a corporate environment just as well as in an open source environment. And they can like, oh, what was there? And like in other cases, oh yeah, we might want to ask IT if they can restore the mail inbox, and like, did we already discard them? Or in Germany, would the workers council say, you may not, for good reasons or less good reasons? And if you have them public in the first place, and this was a public discussion, then you'll have them, then it will work. And this is the same case for actually writing good issues, that actually where you try to achieve the goal of having the issue tell you everything you need to know about the problem at hand. Basically, it's just like you get a file, and in the file, there's everything you need to know. If you manage that, that's fine, because then after some reading up, I'm not saying it works instantly, but once a person has read up, they can actually have an idea of has happened there, or why it has happened there. Because often you have these constructions where you think like, why the hell is this like it is? Shouldn't be different. This totally does not make any sense. In case of, for example, crazy optimizations. Um, and then let's do it differently. And then some days later, load happens, and people find out a second time why the crazy optimization was done, because that was the only way to bear that load. Um, and if you have these archives, you can actually feel like, okay, they had the same pain as we did. They found out the same problem. They don't like the optimization, but they didn't have anything else. So unless we solve the problem that we just see here or have seen here, we'll probably better keep it. So that is something you also gain. You lose less knowledge. Yes, you have to read it. Yes, it is time investment. I'm not concealing that, but it does work. And it's there in the first place, and you don't have to find it out the hard way the second time. So that is that. Um, so resilience against time, resilience against people leaving or coming. You can onboard people faster. For example, you have these issues, have this thread, read it. And then we have this wiki too, which has a bit of information, but probably is outdated. You might want to update this, whatever you have read in the issues. And if then there is something, please ask these, that, and these people, because they're all names on them. This usually gets people on board a lot faster, which you have to do because often open source projects do not have full-time engineers or on them, or full-time managers that could handle such things. But in the first waves, as you had with Mackie, there are with these waves where it was just hobbyists, and yes, they have time for their hobby, and that is about it. So they need to get people on board without the full effort. And the same advantages you can now just use in a more corporate environment, or so that is what has happened there. And it basically is all along the same lines. There are a few specifics if you want to have the full steam going on in a full-time employee environment. That has differences. And if you expect the reaction times of full-time environments, that is also different, but there are approaches to it. What else? So That is about the gist of many of those things.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was extremely extensive, and I thought there were some really great best practices for people to be able to actually implement within their company to make sure remote work works for them.
Yeah.
And I know that there's the advantages of asynchronous and synchronous communication in some senses, but when you gave a few of the examples, I thought they were great best practices. But on the other hand, I know you've probably had a lot of experience seeing things that don't work and that cause remote work to fail for a lot of companies. So, what are some of those things that companies should be aware of when actually trying to implement remote work in the right way? What do they need to be concerned about when starting that or when trying to improve that process?
Oh yeah, yeah, very very good point. Yeah, obviously not everything is basically your average silver bullet, because don't they those don't exist. So
Definitely.
starting off, like, we had Slack, and yeah, I'll like make things less verbose maybe. We had Slack. Slack has this commercially very nicely motivated but very effective 10,000 message border. And if you think,
Yep.
let's do a Slack, um, then yes, please take that into account. If you have your Slack as as your primary channel, and you try to use passive documentation on that one, consider that you might need to actually pay a license for them or use a different structure. I mean, there is, for example, Mattermost, a full remote company actually, um, that offers such a system that also costs money. You can have the free version, not going into that part, but at least it doesn't have the 10,000 message border. Um, so that, for
It is a
example,
pain.
yeah, like things going away.
They delete, don't they?
That is
Yeah.
one thing. Then, for example, um, asynchronous communication and synchronous communication, you need to balance them. That is, there's actually I'm not saying asynchronous is everything, because it isn't. There are some things that should really be synchronous. You need to have or should be synchronous every now and then. You need to also, since once you go remote, you need to replicate the water cooler effect. The water cooler effect and the magic of beer and coffee, or whatever your favorite beverage is. um, I happen to be German, so I need to like beer. But well, actually, without the alcohol, but it's still lovely beer. Um, and that is something you need to replicate, which you can try by means of, for example, meeting every now and then. For example, companies I know that do a yearly retreat or like half a year retreat, and where they basically all convene on an island. In the case of Metromost, as I heard, or yeah, another German company, Komoot, actually does the island case as well, and that actually works for pretty large companies still. And the point is, you basically get to see each other, and you get to have a feel of what the other person is like. Because if you do textual written communication, either you are very 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 explicit in how you mean things and like over communicate effectively, such that you replace the facial expressions and all the nice undertones of language, be it sarcasm or whatever it might be. um like yeah, yeah, let's put it at that one. And yeah, so that is something that you can only interpret once you have seen a person face to face. So you should definitely keep that. um and yeah, and another thing is actually, if you do hybrid situations, for example, like parts of the people are on site, or in the same floor, even that suffices. Or like if you have a really long office, they are basically on two corners of the same office, like five in the meeting room and five didn't make it because the coffee was too delicious, or there was still working, and then like five in Zoom pictures, for example. um, you actually need to ensure that, or this is something that will in very little situations work. Why? Because the audio and the facial and visual fidelity that those people in those five Zoom pictures and those people in the room have are really really different. Even if you have these like Polycom, we had Polycom cameras back then, like we're like trying to capture the 360 people picture of
Yeah.
the room, fancy hardware, but even those do not fully represent the same case as if you would all be a Zoom picture. So in these cases, you can just have everyone be a Zoom picture, even if they are basically on different corners of the same room. But this basically equalizes and levels the participation. So it might be worse for everyone, but at least it is the same for everyone, and that way nobody feels left out. So that's that part. I know companies that actually actively do that. It might even suffice to have different like floors, and you get bubbles across these floors because not everyone might visit the other floor every time. So that. Um, Also, trying to, I mean, in this Corona pandemic, most of us probably did that, like have an implicit or have an not implicit. Before we did that implicitly while we're having a coffee. Now try to actually explicitly have one of those um, coffee meetings, or your average bullshit channel, or like where you can just talk whatever, like the random chat or
Yes.
Slack, if you will. You don't share
The
memes, but
cooler.
like yes, exactly. And like try to do that explicitly. You could either have like a back then it was team speak, or like have a voice call where people just can hop in if they feel like they want to talk some bull crap, or like want to just have a chat. And or like let's have the Friday digital beer or something. It does not replace meeting fully in person. We had that before, but it actually replaces a bit of it, and you can in an informal way discuss things, get to know people, get to know how they feel, what's going on with them, whatever the water cooler did as well. So since it doesn't have happen implicitly anymore, you need to sort of explicitly replace it, but don't make it mandatory. Why have you not been at the water cooler? This is bad. I need you to come to the water cooler. Um, so a lot of that
Okay.
needs to be like not on a mandatory basis, but people should actually want to come there. So you need to make it an inclusive atmosphere and a nice atmosphere. Like, oh, I need to come there to get all the important business details. This is actually a meeting. No, it shouldn't be like that. Um, or like, oh, they're all just all the males, and if I don't participate in, there is a German word called Herrenwitz, like which would probably be an NSFW joke, NSFW. Um, right, which basically excludes people that are not male. You can have the female version or the whatever version as well. Just try to not do that.
Yeah.
And be nice, be civil. Try to include people. That is the gist. So that these are some things that I've
Yeah.
seen failing.
Awesome. I think, yeah, it definitely makes sense. You got to be more explicit about the way that you talk because, like you said, you don't get sarcasm. It's very difficult to get sarcasm over messages. And sometimes it is difficult to really bond with someone. So I think having that in-person event where you actually get to meet the person, you get to figure out who they are, what they like, beyond really, I guess, what you can just do back
Yeah,
and forward
yeah,
in a chat. So I think they're really, really great things that companies can look out for, especially with the pandemic happening and still probably going to be happening for the foreseeable future and beyond.
hmm
So yeah,
hmm
thank you
hmm
so much. I appreciate that, Johannes. It's been great chatting, and I'd definitely
hmm
love to get you on at another time in the future.
Sure, sure. I'll love to. Bye.